The rancher offered her shelter from the storm. She left at dawn, and so did half his cattle. The storm arrived without warning, as storms do in the high country. One moment, the evening sky stretched clear and purple above the ranch. The next, it split open like an old wound, spilling rain that struck the earth with the force of angry fists. Marcus Holloway stood on his porch, watching the water wash the dust from his boots and the blood from the wooden steps where he'd cleaned rabbits that morning. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the tin roof of his house like bullets on a battlefield. He'd heard that sound before, in places he tried not to remember, when he wore a badge and believed in justice. Now he wore only the weight of 43 years and the silence of a man who'd buried too much. Thunder rolled across the valley like the wheels of a wagon loaded with the dead. Marcus pulled his coat tighter and turned toward the warmth of his kitchen, where coffee waited and the fire still held back the October cold. But something made him stop. A movement in the storm, a shadow that didn't belong to the swaying cottonwoods or the frightened horses in the corral. Through the sheets of rain, he saw her, a girl, maybe 17, stumbling up the muddy path that led to his door. Her dress hung in tatters, dark with rain, and something else, something that might have been blood. Her hair, black as crow feathers, plastered against her skull. She moved like a wounded animal, each step deliberate and desperate, her thin arms wrapped around herself as if holding her pieces together. Marcus had learned, in his years alone, to trust his gut more than his eyes. His gut told him to close the door, bolt it tight, and pretend he'd seen nothing. Strangers brought trouble, and trouble was something he'd had enough of to last 3 lifetimes. But when she lifted her face to the porch light, he saw something that stopped his hand on the door handle. She had Emma's eyes. Not the same color. Emma's had been blue as summer sky, while this girl's were dark as river stones. But they held the same look, the same desperate hunger for safety that his daughter had worn the night she'd come to him after her husband's fists had painted her face in shades of purple and black. The same look she'd carried to her grave 6 months later, when the fever took her and left Marcus with nothing but regrets and the echo of words he'd never said. The girl stumbled, caught herself against the porch rail. Her lips moved, forming words lost in the thunder, but Marcus didn't need to hear them. He'd seen enough desperation to recognize it in the dark. He opened the door. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Before you drown out there." She hesitated, swaying on her feet like wheat in wind. Her eyes darted from his face to the rifle hanging above the door, to the badge collecting dust on the kitchen table visible through the doorway. A lawman's badge, silver stars tarnished with age and memory. "I won't hurt you," Marcus said, stepping back to give her room. "Whatever's chasing you can't follow you in here." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she crossed the threshold like a ghost stepping into the world of the living. Water dripped from her clothes onto his clean floor, forming puddles that reflected the lamplight like scattered coins. Up close, she looked even younger. Her face held the sharp angles of hunger, the hollow cheeks of someone who'd learned to go without. But her hands, he noticed her hands most of all. They shook like leaves in autumn wind, not from cold but from something deeper. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair by the fire. "You're soaked through." She obeyed without speaking, moving carefully as if sudden movements might shatter something fragile inside her. Marcus poured coffee from the pot that always sat warming on his stove, added sugar and cream without asking her preference. He'd learned that kindness sometimes had to be forced on people who'd forgotten how to accept it. The coffee cup rattled against her teeth when she drank. Her eyes never left his face, watching him with the wariness of a cornered animal. She wore a silver locket around her neck, tarnished and dented, the chain broken and retied with string. A poor girl's treasure, held together by hope and stubbornness. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her. She took another sip of coffee before answering. "Sarah," she said, the word barely a whisper. "Sarah Kane." He nodded, filing the name away with all the other details he couldn't help but notice. The way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right, as if protecting old pain. the scar that ran like a thin white line across her knuckles. The fact that she'd glanced at his silver twice now, counting value with eyes that had learned to measure worth in terms of survival. "I'm Marcus," he said. "This is my place." Outside, the storm raged on, rain hammering the roof and windows like it meant to tear the house apart board by board. But inside, warmth slowly crept back into the girl's pale cheeks. She stopped shivering, though her hands still trembled when she reached for the coffee cup. "Thank you," she said, and something in her voice made Marcus think of Emma again. The same quiet gratitude, the same careful politeness of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from the world. He studied her face in the firelight, searching for clues to her story. The bruise on her temple, faded but still visible. The way she held herself, like someone used to making herself small and invisible. The desperate hunger in her eyes when she'd looked at his warm house through the storm. "You running from something?" he asked. Her cup stopped halfway to her lips. For a moment, he thought she might lie, might spin some story about visiting relatives or traveling to find work. But then she set the cup down and met his eyes directly. "Someone," she said. Marcus nodded. He'd been running from someone too, in his way. Running from the memory of failures, from the weight of badges he could no longer wear with honor, from the ghost of a daughter he'd failed to save. "Well," he said, rising to poke at the fire, "storm like this will keep anyone from following tonight. You can sleep in Emma's room." He hadn't meant to say his daughter's name. It slipped out like a prayer, unexpected and raw. Sarah's dark eyes softened with something that might have been understanding. "I don't want to be trouble," she said. Marcus looked at her then, really looked, saw the exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for young shoulders. Saw the way she clutched that broken locket like it contained her last hope. Saw Emma's face in the shadows of her cheekbones, Emma's desperate need in the curve of her mouth. Maybe mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Maybe kindness was a weakness that would cost him more than he could pay. But looking at this girl, this child, he remembered why he'd pinned on a badge in the first place all those years ago, before cynicism had carved the hope from his heart, before he'd learned that good intentions paved roads to places no man wanted to go. "We're all trouble to someone," he said finally, turning back to the fire, so she wouldn't see the ghosts moving behind his eyes. "Question is whether we're worth the cost." The storm continued its assault on the night, but inside Marcus Holloway's house, two broken souls shared coffee in silence, neither knowing that kindness, like lightning, could illuminate and destroy in the same brilliant moment. Morning came gray and reluctant, filtering through the kitchen windows like weak tea. Marcus had been awake since before dawn, standing at the stove making cornbread the way his wife Helen had taught him 30 years ago. The familiar rhythm of mixing, kneading, and waiting gave his hands something to do, while his mind wrestled with the decision he'd made in the storm's fury. Sarah sat at his kitchen table, small and still as a church mouse. She'd changed from her torn dress into one of Emma's old gowns, the blue cotton hanging loose on her thin frame. The transformation unsettled him more than her bedraggled appearance had the night before. In Emma's dress, with her dark hair braided back, she looked even more like his daughter, like a ghost wearing familiar clothes. She ate the way hungry people learn to eat, he noticed. Small bites, slow and careful, as if each morsel might be her last. But her eyes were busy as a shopkeeper's during harvest season. They moved constantly, cataloging everything within sight. The silver-plated candlesticks on the mantel, the cash box he kept on the high shelf, the way the back door latch caught when the wood swelled with moisture. Marcus poured himself coffee and sat across from her, pretending not to notice how she counted the forks in the drawer when she thought he wasn't looking. He'd seen that look before, in his years wearing a badge. The calculating gaze of someone measuring risk against reward, mapping escape routes while smiling at your kindness. "Sleep well?" he asked, buttering a piece of cornbread. "Yes, sir." Her voice remained soft, polite. "Thank you for your kindness." The words had the practiced sound of someone who'd learned to say the right things. Marcus nodded and sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of his cup. She flinched when thunder rolled across the valley. The storm hadn't finished with them yet, but her eyes never stopped their careful inventory. "Storm's not done," he said. "You'll be staying another night. Seems like..." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment? Relief? It passed too quickly for him to be sure. "I don't want to impose," she said, the same careful politeness. No imposition. Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out at the rain that still fell in steady sheets. "Haven't had company in months. Gets quiet out here." That was true enough. Since Emma's death, the silence had become a weight he carried everywhere. The house felt too big, too empty, filled with the echoes of conversations that would never happen and laughter that had died with his daughter. Having another voice in the rooms, even one that spoke in whispers and half-truths, eased something in his chest he hadn't realized was tight. He turned back to find Sarah studying the photograph on the side table. Helen and Emma, taken the summer before the fever claimed them both. Helen's hand rested on Emma's shoulder, both women smiling at something beyond the camera's eye. It was the last picture he had of them together, the last proof that he'd once been part of something larger than his own regrets. "Your family?" Sarah asked. "Was." The word came out harder than he intended. "Wife and daughter. They're gone now." Sarah's fingers touched the broken locket at her throat, and for a moment, her careful mask slipped. He saw genuine sorrow there, the kind that recognized itself in others. "I'm sorry," she said, and this time the words carried weight. Marcus nodded and returned to his chair. Outside, the rain drummed against the windows with renewed force, and lightning split the gray sky like a preacher's condemnation. Sarah jumped at the thunder, her hand moving instinctively to shield her face, a gesture so familiar it made Marcus's chest ache. Emma had done the same thing during storms, ever since she was small. Even as a grown woman, she'd flinch and cover her face when thunder cracked too close. Some fears, Marcus knew, lived in the bones long after the mind forgot their origins. Without thinking, he rose and fetched Helen's shawl from the closet, the one she'd worn every evening, sitting by this same window and watching the sun set over the valley. It still smelled of her lavender soap and the rose water she'd dabbed behind her ears on Sundays. He kept it folded in tissue paper, but now he shook it out and draped it around Sarah's narrow shoulders. "Helen made this," he said quietly. "She'd want it used." Sarah pulled the shawl closer, burying her face in its softness. For a moment, she looked like what she was, a scared girl, far from home, carrying burdens too heavy for her years. The calculating look disappeared, replaced by something raw and grateful. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Marcus returned to his coffee, but his eyes stayed on her. She wore the shawl like armor, clutching it tight around herself. But even wrapped in his wife's memory, her gaze continued its methodical survey. She memorized the placement of keys on their hooks, noted which floorboards creaked, studied the lock on the front door with the attention of someone who might need to open it quietly in the dark. He should have been alarmed, should have recognized the signs his years of law enforcement had taught him to read. But when she smiled at him over her coffee cup, shy and grateful and heartbreakingly young, all he could see was Emma. Emma, who'd trusted the wrong man and paid with her life. Emma, who needed her father's protection and received only his failure. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Where are you from?" Sarah's hands stilled on the coffee cup. "East of here," she said carefully. "Little town called Millfield." Not much to tell. Millfield. Marcus knew the name, though he'd never been there. A mining town, mostly, with a reputation for rough men and rougher justice. The kind of place where a girl like Sarah might learn to count silver and measure escape routes. "What brought you this far west?" he asked. "Work," she said. "Heard there might be work in the settlements." Another careful answer, revealing nothing. Marcus nodded as if satisfied, but his mind filed away the details that didn't fit. The way she spoke, with better grammar than most mining town children received. The silver locket she protected so fiercely, expensive once, though tarnished now. The small calluses on her fingertips that spoke of delicate work, not the rough labor that would have been her lot in Millfield. Sarah finished her cornbread and rose to clear her plate, moving through his kitchen with careful efficiency. She washed the dishes without being asked, dried them with Helen's good towels, put everything back exactly where she'd found it. Helpful, considerate, the perfect house guest. But Marcus noticed how she opened each cabinet as she worked, cataloging contents. How she tested the weight of the iron skillet, the sharpness of the carving knife. How her eyes lingered on the small safe hidden behind Helen's preserves, the one she shouldn't have been able to see from her angle at the sink. The storm continued its assault on the valley, trapping them together in the warm circle of lamplight. Sarah settled back at the table with her coffee, Helen's shawl still wrapped around her shoulders like borrowed safety. She looked so young, so fragile, that Marcus felt his suspicions dissolve like sugar in rain. Maybe he was seeing threats where none existed. Maybe years of solitude had made him paranoid, reading criminal intent into the natural wariness of a girl who'd learned the world could be cruel. Maybe she was just what she appeared to be, a lost child in need of shelter, carrying nothing more dangerous than her own desperate hope for a better life. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and Sarah pressed deeper into the shawl's embrace. In the lamplight, with rain streaming down the windows and the fire crackling in the hearth, she looked like she belonged here. Like she was the daughter he'd failed to save, given a second chance to accept his protection. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. "Of Emma." Sarah looked up from her coffee, her dark eyes unreadable. "She was lucky," she said, "to have a father who cared." The words hit him like a physical blow. Lucky! Emma, who'd died young and afraid, who'd married badly and suffered for it, who'd come to him for help he'd been too proud and stubborn to give properly. Lucky was she? He asked, the question torn from some deep place in his chest. Sarah studied his face with those calculating eyes, but now he thought he saw something else there too. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit carrying his own weight of failure. "Yes," she said simply. She was outside. The storm raged on, washing the world clean while leaving the stains on their souls untouched. Marcus poured more coffee and settled back to wait for morning, unaware that he was watching the most dangerous kind of thief, the kind who stole not just silver and cattle, but the very trust that held a man's heart together, leaving him richer in hope and poorer in everything that mattered. The rain drummed its ancient rhythm against the roof, and in the warm kitchen, two souls shared bread and bitter trust, neither knowing that mercy, once given, becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. Dawn came pale and cold, the storm's fury spent in the night like a man's rage after he'd broken everything worth keeping. Marcus woke to silence, the kind of deep quiet that comes after nature has finished its tantrum and moved on, leaving only wreckage and regret in its wake. He dressed in the gray light filtering through his bedroom window, his bones creaking like old floorboards. 45 years of hard living had settled into his joints like winter frost, making each morning a negotiation between will and flesh. But something felt wrong in the stillness. Not just the absence of storm, but something deeper. The house felt hollow, emptied of more than just sound. In the kitchen, he found the first sign. The coffee pot sat cold on the stove, no fire laid beneath it. Sarah's cup from the night before sat washed and dried on the counter, placed with the careful precision of someone saying goodbye without words. The chair where she'd sat wrapped in Helen's shawl sat pushed in tight against the table, as if she'd tried to erase all evidence of her presence. Marcus walked to Emma's room, though he already knew what he'd find. The door stood open like a mouth frozen in surprise. The bed lay empty, covers pulled tight and smooth, the pillow still bearing the faint impression of a head that had rested uneasy through the night. Emma's blue dress hung on its peg, discarded like a shed skin. In its place, Sarah had left behind only absence and the fading scent of lavender from Helen's shawl. The shawl. He found it folded neat and careful on the dresser, placed with the same funeral precision she'd given the coffee cup. His fingers traced the soft wool, still warm from her body, still carrying her smell beneath Helen's roses. She'd worn it right until the moment she left, then abandoned it like everything else she'd touched in his house, used and discarded when its purpose was served. He should have gone looking for her then, should have saddled his horse and followed whatever trail she'd left in the mud. But something in his gut told him to check the cattle first. Maybe it was the lawman's instinct he'd never quite buried, or maybe it was the terrible certainty that comes when a man finally sees the trap he's walked into with his eyes wide open. The barn stood empty of all but shadows and the sweet smell of hay. His horse, Thunder, nickered soft greeting from his stall, but the other sounds Marcus expected, the shuffling and lowing of cattle in the pen beyond, never came. He walked through the barn slow as a funeral march, his boots echoing in the emptiness, knowing what waited outside, but needing to see it with his own eyes. The cattle pen stretched before him like a wound in the earth. 40 head of prime beef, his life's work and retirement security, simply gone. The gate hung open, its latch broken clean through. Not cut, but snapped with the kind of force that spoke of preparation and tools. Professional work. The work of someone who knew cattle and how to move them quiet through the night. Marcus stood at the fence line, his hands gripping the top rail until his knuckles went white. The tracks told the story clear as scripture. 40 sets of hoof prints heading north toward the high country, driven by riders who knew their business. Boot prints too, small ones mixed with larger men's prints. Sarah's feet had walked this path, had helped drive his cattle into the darkness while he slept trusting in his own kitchen. The mist hung low over the valley, but it couldn't hide the truth. Marcus had been played like a fiddle by a master musician, every note of his kindness turned into a melody of theft. She'd counted his silver, memorized his locks, studied his routines, all while he draped his dead wife's shawl around her shoulders and saw his lost daughter in her lying eyes. He walked the fence line, reading the story written in mud and broken grass. They'd been careful, professional. No panic, no rushing. The cattle had been moved calm and quiet, probably drugged with something to keep them docile. This wasn't the desperate act of a hungry girl. This was business, cold and calculated as a banker's foreclosure. Back in the house, Marcus sat heavy in his kitchen chair and stared at the badge lying on the table where it had collected dust for 3 years. The silver stars caught the morning light, winking at him like eyes that had seen too much. He'd worn that badge with pride once, had believed in justice and law and the idea that good men could make the wild country safe for decent folk. But good men, he'd learned, were the easiest marks of all. Their very goodness made them blind to the darkness that lived in others. A bad man expected betrayal. A good man opened his door to strangers in storms and wrapped them in his dead wife's memory. The badge had weight to it, more than silver should carry. 3 years since he'd taken it off and set it on this table. 3 years since he'd decided the world had enough disappointed lawmen. He'd bought this ranch with his savings, built it into something peaceful and profitable, and told himself he was done with the business of judging other men's sins. But sins, it seemed, had a way of finding even retired judges. Marcus picked up the badge, felt its familiar weight in his palm. The star-shaped cutouts that let in light and shadow, the inscription worn smooth by years of handling. Sheriff, Clearwater County. He'd been proud of those words once. They meant something when he believed the law could protect the innocent and punish the guilty in equal measure. Now, they felt like an epitaph for the man he used to be. He thought of Sarah's face in the lamplight, the way she'd clutched Helen's shawl and flinched at Thunder, the practiced gratitude in her voice, the careful way she'd eaten his food and accepted his kindness. Had any of it been real? Or was it all just another kind of professional skill, the ability to read a man's weaknesses and play them like piano keys? The coffee pot sat cold and empty on the stove, but Marcus didn't move to light the fire. He sat holding his badge and thinking about mercy, how it felt like love when you gave it, and like stupidity when it was thrown back in your face. He wanted to save her the way he'd failed to save Emma. Wanted to be the father he'd never been, the protector he'd fallen short of becoming. Instead, he'd been the mark, the easy touch, The lonely old fool who saw what he wanted to see and ignored everything his experience screamed was wrong. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the empty pen in all its stark reality. 40 head of cattle, worth enough to keep him comfortable through his remaining years, driven north by thieves who'd worn his trust like a disguise. The girl who'd reminded him of Emma was probably counting her share of the profit by now, Helen shawl forgotten like everything else she'd touched in his life. Marcus set the badge back on the table and rose to make coffee. His hands moved automatic through the familiar ritual, water, grounds, fire, while his mind wrestled with harder questions. What did a man do when mercy betrayed him? When kindness became the tool of his own destruction? When the very goodness he'd tried to cultivate turned into weakness that thieves could smell like blood in the water? The coffee began to bubble, filling the empty kitchen with its rich scent. But the emptiness inside Marcus ran deeper than any drink could fill. He'd lost more than cattle in the night. He'd lost the faith that good deeds mattered, that kindness had meaning, that a man could trust the evidence of his own decent instincts. He'd lost the last fragments of the man who'd worn that badge with pride. Through the window, he could see the empty pen, the broken gate, the tracks that led away from everything he'd built into a life that made sense. Somewhere out there, Sarah Kane was counting blood money while he counted the cost of believing that mercy was anything more than a luxury honest men couldn't afford. The badge caught the light again, its silver stars reflecting a kitchen that felt too big and too quiet for one man's regrets. Soon, he'd have to decide what came next, whether to let the theft stand or pin on that star one more time and ride north toward a reckoning that might cost him more than cattle. But for now, he sat with his coffee and his shame, learning the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest cruelty was not the taking, but the trust that made the taking possible. Marcus found her 3 days later at Widow's Creek, just as he'd known he would. Some hunches ran deeper than logic, and this one had pulled him north through the high country like iron to a magnet. She sat on a fallen log beside the water, counting silver coins in the morning light, her small hands moving with the careful precision of someone who'd never had enough money to count carelessly. The cattle were gone, of course. Sold at the rail station in Millhaven, probably, where no questions got asked about brands or bills of sale. 40 head of prime beef turned into silver dollars that caught the sun like scattered stars. She'd made good time, driving them hard through the storm's aftermath while he sat in his empty kitchen wrestling with ghosts and regrets. Marcus dismounted slow and quiet, his horse's hooves making soft sounds in the creekside grass. Thunder snorted once and fell silent, as if he understood the weight of the moment. The morning mist hung low over the water, turning the world soft and dreamlike, but Marcus felt wide awake for the first time in days. He drew his gun, the same Colt .45 he'd carried as sheriff, cleaned and loaded the night before with hands that remembered the ritual. The weight felt familiar in his palm, heavy with more than just steel and lead. It carried the weight of justice postponed, of mercy repaid with betrayal, of a good man pushed past the boundaries of his own patience. Sarah must have heard him approach, but she didn't turn. She continued counting her silver, stacking the coins in neat piles on the log beside her. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, no longer braided in the careful style she'd worn in his kitchen. She looked older somehow, or maybe just tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came after a job well done, but too costly to celebrate. 40 head, Marcus said, his voice carrying clear across the water. Worth about $800 at current market prices. Her hand stilled on the coins, but she didn't look back. Closer to 900, she said quietly. They were good cattle. Well-fed. Healthy. My life's work. I know. The words came out flat, empty of emotion. I'm sorry for that. Marcus stepped closer, close enough to see the way her shoulders hunched forward, close enough to hear the hitch in her breathing that spoke of tears held back by will alone. Sorry enough to give it back? She laughed then, but there was no humor in it. The sound fell into the creek's murmur like a stone into dark water. It's already gone. split 3 ways and spent on supplies. Food, medicine, things people needed more than you needed cattle. People. Marcus kept his gun trained on her back, though something in his chest was starting to ache. Your family? My family. She turned then, slow as sunrise, and Marcus felt the world shift beneath his feet. Tears had cut clean channels through the trail dust on her cheeks, and her dark eyes held a pain that went deeper than fear. My brother, mostly. He's sick. Has been for months. The medicine costs more than we could earn in a year of honest work. The gun felt heavy in Marcus's hand, heavier than it should, weighted with the terrible complexity of human need. So you decided to steal from a man who showed you kindness. I decided to steal from a man who had 40 head of cattle and lived alone in a house big enough for 6 people. Her voice carried the sharp edge of anger now, cutting through the morning mist like a blade. A man who wore a sheriff's badge but chose to live fat and comfortable while people starved in mining camps. The words hit him like physical blows. Marcus had wondered, during the long ride north, what story she'd tell herself to justify the theft. Now he knew. He was the villain in her tale, the rich man hoarding wealth while the poor suffered, the retired lawman who'd abandoned his duty to justice and mercy. You don't know anything about my life, he said, but even as he spoke, he could hear the weakness in his own voice. I know you had a wife and daughter who died while you were off playing sheriff. Sarah's eyes blazed with righteous fury now, tears forgotten. I know you came home to an empty house and 40 head of cattle and decided that was enough. That you'd earned the right to sit comfortable while the world burned around you. Each word found its mark with the precision of a practiced gunfighter. Marcus felt his certainty wavering, felt the moral ground shifting beneath his feet like creek sand in spring flood. Had he been selfish? Had he chosen comfort over duty, safety over service? I did my time, he said, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. Your time. Sarah stood now, facing him fully, and Marcus saw not the calculating thief, but the desperate child he'd sheltered from a storm. Tell me, Sheriff Holloway, how much time does a man owe to justice? How many years of service buy him the right to ignore suffering when it knocks on his door? The gun trembled in Marcus's grip, not from fear, but from the terrible weight of recognition. She was right, and they both knew it. He'd hung up his badge not because he'd served enough, but because serving had cost him everything he'd held dear. His wife, dead of fever while he chased outlaws through the territories. His daughter, married too young to escape her grief, dead before he could make amends for his absence. I saved you from the storm, he said weakly. You saved your own conscience. Sarah's voice had gone soft again, but the softness carried more pain than her anger had. You saw your dead daughter in my face and thought maybe you could buy back some of what you'd lost. But redemption doesn't work that way, Sheriff. You can't save the living to resurrect the dead. The words hung in the mist between them like a judgment. Marcus had spent 3 years telling himself he'd retired from law enforcement because he'd earned peace. But standing here in the morning light, facing this girl who'd stolen his cattle and his illusions both, he finally understood the truth. He'd quit because he was tired of failing people. Because every criminal he caught, every law he enforced, seemed to cost him something precious. Because the badge had become a weight he couldn't carry without losing everything that made carrying it worthwhile. The money won't save your brother, he said finally. Sarah's face crumpled then, the mask of anger falling away to reveal the scared child beneath. Maybe not, she whispered, but it gives him a chance. More chance than he had before. Marcus looked at her, really looked, and saw not the thief who'd betrayed his trust, but the sister who'd risked everything for love. Saw the girl who'd walked through storm and darkness to steal from a stranger because her family had no other hope. Saw himself, maybe, if he'd had the courage to risk everything for the people he'd loved. The gun felt impossibly heavy now. Justice demanded he arrest her, bring her back to face trial, see her hanged or imprisoned for grand theft. But mercy, the same mercy that had opened his door to her in the storm, whispered a different answer. Take it, he said quietly, lowering the weapon. Sarah stared at him, confusion replacing the pain in her eyes. What? The money. Take it. Go to your brother. Buy his medicine. Marcus holstered the gun with hands that shook like autumn leaves. But don't come back to my valley. Don't ever let me see your face again. For a long moment, they stood facing each other across the space between mercy and justice, between law and love. Sarah gathered the silver coins with trembling fingers, stuffing them into her pockets with the desperate haste of someone who feared the offer might be withdrawn. But before she turned to go, she did something that surprised them both. She pulled a small leather pouch from her jacket and set it carefully on the log where she'd been counting silver. The pouch clinked softly, more coins, enough to buy supplies for a month or two. It's not much, she said, not meeting his eyes, but it's all I kept for myself. For after, Marcus stared at the pouch, understanding suddenly that this girl, this thief who'd played his kindness like a fiddle, had given him something more valuable than money. She'd given him the truth about who he was, about what his mercy was worth, about the price of choosing safety over service. Why, he asked. Sarah looked up then, and for a moment he saw Emma in her face again. Not the calculating resemblance that had fooled him before, but something deeper. The look of someone who understood that sometimes the hardest choice was knowing when to walk away. Because you're a good man, Sheriff Holloway, she said quietly. Even when goodness costs more than you can afford. She turned and walked into the morning mist, her small form disappearing among the cottonwoods like a ghost returning to whatever realm had spawned her. Marcus stood alone beside Widow's Creek, holding a pouch of silver coins and the terrible gift of understanding. He'd lost his cattle, his trust, his illusions about human nature. But he'd gained something harder to name, the knowledge that mercy was not weakness, even when it was betrayed. That sometimes the greatest victory was choosing to lose with grace. The mist began to lift as the sun climbed higher, revealing the empty landscape in all its morning beauty. Marcus mounted Thunder and turned south toward home, carrying silver coins and the weight of choice, knowing that some prizes were worth more than the cattle they cost, and some lessons could only be learned by those brave enough to pay their price in full.